afternoon. If anyone can't hear me, just put up your hand and then I'll try to talk a bit louder and more into the mic. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out on this frigid Montreal afternoon. As was just mentioned, my name is Christopher Stumm. I grew up in Toronto, Canada, and studied computer science at the University of Toronto before I migrated south of the border. After university, I spent a few years working at Microsoft on a product called SkyDrive, now known as OneDrive. And now I'm an engineer who works on product at Etsy. And that means I work on things that range from search results pages to listing pages to the home page, etc. So how many of you know what Etsy is? Great. Etsy is a magical place. For those of you that don't already know, Etsy is an online marketplace for small independent creative businesses. And we have over 43 million members and more than 26 million listings being sold by more than 1.2 million active sellers. Both buyers and sellers, they're located all over the world. In fact, over 25% of our transactions happen across borders. It's a peer-to-peer marketplace, and we emphasize the interactions between real people. And the kinds of items that are sold on Etsy really span a broad range. What you're looking at here is the signed-in homepage where you see a feed of items based on your tastes and taste makers that you follow. And so I'm going to quickly show you a few listings that I like that kind of give you an idea or a taste for the different types of items. So here is a modular cabinet set, which also doubles as pet furniture. And this is a crocheted toy based on a kid's drawing, and you can actually get custom versions of this where you send in your child's drawing, and the seller will make a version of the drawing in a crocheted toy. This is a grandpa whale stuffed animal. It's maybe hard to tell from this image, but it's quite large, about 70 centimeters in length, which is about 2 feet for the Americans in the audience. These are some of the listings that make up the $1.3 billion in sales that we had in 2013, and all these items are great, but what's actually really important about these items is that they're made by real people, and in this case, by a woman named Dana Muscat. In an interview, Dana mentioned that at precisely the time that she decided she was sick of waiting for making money from her art, it happened. And it happened through Etsy. And this is an important point because she falls into the 3/4 of sellers who consider their shop a business. In fact, 18% of sellers on Etsy say selling their creative goods is their full-time occupation. Dana, like 88% of our sellers in the US, are women. By contrast, 29% of US enterprises are owned by women. So when we work on projects, it's really important to remind ourselves that there are real people on the other end. In the case of Etsy, there are people's livelihoods that are at stake. Everyone is making some of their income, in some cases, all of their income from their Etsy shops. And so when we're making changes to the site, it has real financial repercussions for these people. And so I'm going to go over the history of experimentation and give you a quick tour and overview of the evolution of our product development cycle to ensure that we're doing the right thing by the sellers and to keep ourselves honest. So back in the day, we picked projects based largely on what sounded the coolest. And this is the way that a lot of companies actually, surprisingly, pick their products. And the way it would generally work is we'd make a feature, we would release it, we'd announce it and have a launch party, and everyone would get really excited and cheer for it and be really happy. And this would happen over and over and over again. And an example of this feature was a product that we launched was called Alchemy. And we launched this in 2008 to a lot of fanfare. It was generally considered awesome. The idea was, sorry. It was a feature where buyers would describe items that they wanted and sellers would bid to make the item. It's an interesting idea and it was written up in a bunch of places, including the New York Times. Sadly, the product was killed in 2011 for lack of use, amongst other things. And over the 3-year lifespan of this feature, it sold less listings than the rest of the site sold in a single day. So ultimately, it was a huge disappointment to Etsy. So what we learned was that we had to measure the impact of the changes we were making. With a site that's constantly growing, it's actually really easy to take credit for growth of the growth through new features that we're adding, because when in fact they're largely an externality, growth that would happen regardless of whether we'd made our changes. And so we changed our kind of product development process slightly, and we tacked on A/B testing to the end of our development process. So for those that aren't familiar, A/B testing is where you take your users and you split them up into 2 groups. You give one set of users what's called the control, i.e. the existing implementation, and the other set of users the new treatment, i.e. your change. Then you can decide whether to release a feature based on an objective measurement that is applied to both groups. People often talk about A/B testing like it's magic, and you'll get your results instantly and with an obvious answer. But in reality, it's really dirty, and it looks a lot more like this. So when you start to measure your results, you realize how many ideas that seem great in theory turn out to be not so amazing. So plan to be wrong. Your intuition will be wrong a surprising amount of the time. And this is especially true as your users diverge from you. And this will happen as your product is used by more and more people. And this can happen because they're coming from different cultures, different languages, different backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. And the results are surprising, and we learned that in a rather painful way with the next feature that I'm going to talk about, infinite scroll. Infinite scroll, for those of you that might use a different term, is where you load the next set of results in seamlessly underneath the previous set. You see this behavior in Instagram as you scroll through your feed of images. It seemed like an obvious thing to do at the time, with the belief that showing more listings to users faster would be great. Users were asking for it, it followed mantras echoed around the web, and so off we went and we built it. Sadly, or strangely, when we got back our experiment results, they were no good. So we figured there were bugs. I mean, this was obviously a good idea. We found a few issues, and we fixed them and relaunched the experiment. Still no dice. So we sent someone to test the feature on a shipbox computer in a public library to make sure that it was still working. We sliced the data in all the different ways we could think, and still no luck. Even with Chrome users, it wasn't really the metrics that we were hoping for. In the end, people viewed less listings in search, they clicked through to less listings, they favorited fewer items, they purchased fewer items through search, and basically every metric that we could take and show that it was a win was negative. And so at this point, we went back and we decided to validate our original assumptions, which much to our surprise, turned out didn't hold true for this feature. This was a terrible thing to find out after we'd spent all this time building the feature. And so the lesson that we learned in this case, or from this experiment, was to validate our assumptions up front and do it before. So we go back and look at our kind of product development cycle here. The third version that you see here is we validate our assumptions up front. And this is kind of what we do today. It's a lot more complicated than the previous versions, but there's good reasons for that. We may also do prototyping up front or build no-frills versions or minimal viable products, whatever you want to call it, and test it. But the point is, you want to do the easier work and faster work up front, because if at any stage we realize that it's not going to work, we can just abandon ship and avoid doing all the hard engineering work, like we threw out with infinite scroll. Because ultimately, throwing out work really sucks. It's really painful. We're irrational when it comes to sunk cost, and if we spend a bunch of time on something, we'll keep hammering away in the hopes that we can maybe make it a win. And so we keep searching for metrics that will maybe prove that it's actually the right thing to do. So how can we avoid spending all this time on work that will get thrown out? If we look back at the infinite scroll experiment, what were the hypotheses that we had? More listings and faster performance. And so I'm going to go over how we'd validate these two hypotheses with real code. First, I'm going to show you how we run experiments at Etsy. And this is actually how we develop all new features. It's simply an if-else block. If the feature is enabled for a user, they get the new feature. Otherwise, they get the existing feature. The isEnabled call can return a different result for each user depending on the configuration setting, which I'll get to momentarily. So I'll show you how we would validate the more listings premise in the case of our last experiment. So we have this getResultsCount function, which returns 40 right now. So then we would display 40 results on the search results page. We're going to use our feature flag here. And we add the feature check with our feature flag, which is in this case search 60 results. And once it's enabled, we'll return more listings. So far, we haven't added it to our config file, so it's off by default. So now I'm going to show you how adding the config works, and how as we progress through the different stages of the development, we'll update the config to expose the feature to more people. This is the initial config that you'll push out. It's off for everybody, so no one sees 60 results yet. As I work on the feature, I might choose to enable it for myself or the accounts that I'm testing with. And so that's just my account name up there. Once I've finished putting it together, the feature, I might enable it for the rest of my team so they can try it out. Once we're comfortable with how things look, we'll release it to everybody at Etsy. And so then the config will look like this. At this point, we would solicit feedback, make minor adjustments, or possibly big adjustments, depending on the feedback that we see from the company. And once we're comfortable, we will release it to a subset of users in our A/B test. So depending on the number of users that are eligible to see the treatment, I'll turn on the feature for a different percentage of users. In this case, I might say turn it on for 10%. I'll use an experiment calculator that we have to do the math to figure out how long to run the experiment for, depending on the percentage that I pick. So at this point, I have my small change and my config, and so I'm going to push it out. And so I'm going to quickly go over the deploy process at Etsy, and this happens about 50 times a day at Etsy. Now, this number isn't super relevant to people outside of the company, but it is relevant to us because it allows us to measure whether or not the number of deploys is going up or down. And it gives us a signal about how comfortable we are deploying. And deploying frequently keeps us comfortable, and keeping changes nice and small and understandable. And we try to make the deployment process as simple as possible. In fact, so simple that anybody can do it. It's expected that a designer or a PM can do it. And in fact, here's a photo of Fred Wilson, who's a VC, and he's deploying the Etsy site. In fact, the guy in the background is so bored, he's texting on his phone while it's happening. So this is how you deploy the site. Through an internal site called Deployinator. We've actually open sourced this tool, so you could use it for your own deployment process if you wanted. It's 2 buttons. There's no ambiguity. All the errors that happen are displayed inline, and if you see any, you know what to do, or you can easily talk to the team who built the tool about whether this error was expected or not. You have links to the important pages. It's easy to add for new stacks, so we have different deployments for different stacks. Search Stack has its own stack, its own deployinator. And the key point is that no one needs to go onto that one machine to run that weird command from their bash history. So how do you do it? The first step is you click the top button, and that deploys the site to the pre-production environment, and it kicks off a set of automated tests. Once it's deployed, you would go to this pre-production site, which is exactly the same as production. It uses production data, but it's only accessible internally. You would verify your changes, make sure the site looks okay, and once the tests have passed, you would then click the second button, and the second button goes to production. And this whole process takes less time than it takes for me to give this entire talk. Once you've deployed, you would go to the deploy dashboard and make sure that the graphs look okay. And we're crazy about collecting metrics and graphing things. We have graphs about graphs. But these are the graphs that are important when you're deploying. And this only shows 3 of them on this page. But there's a whole bunch more, and every product has its own dashboard that you'll watch when you're releasing that feature. But the key ones that everyone watches would be on this deploy dashboard. The vertical lines correspond to deployments, so you can see whether or not the behavior change corresponds to a specific deployment. In this case, it also lets you see the frequency with which we deploy. This is a tool that we have called SuperGrip, which is basically a fancy tail of the logs, so you don't have to log into a separate machine. You can filter to, just like you could grep. And so another thing that you get for free by adding these configs is making experiments easy to understand. This is our A/B analysis tool, and we call it Catapult. I don't really have a lot of time to go into depth about this tool. If you're interested, you can go online. There's other talks by another engineer called Will Stuckey that talks about this tool at length. But the key is that you get this for free. It measures the high-level metrics that you're interested in and shows you how your experiment is doing. It does all the difficult math in terms of figuring out whether something is statistically significant or whether the change is just noise. And that's really handy to have. This is the experiment calculator I'd mentioned earlier. It's actually a public tool, but we use it to figure out how long we need to run an experiment for. This is also a useful piece in validating your experiment. If you enter numbers in here and it says it's going to take 10 months to get your experiment results, it's maybe not such a good idea to do that experiment. Speaking of validating your ideas, it really helps to internalize the key metrics for your business. These will vary depending on what you're working on, but for a site like Etsy, it's things like daily visits, lifetime value of the user, conversions, traffic by page, where the person is coming from, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is what the site looks like for Etsy employees. You can see at the top, there's a toolbar which gives the kind of the numbers that we think are important. One of the key ones we have in the top left is the performance of that page. But there's other things there as well. And one of them is kind of an experiment tab. And the experiment tab looks like this. It gives you information on what A/B experiments are running on this page. So in this case, there's about 80 experiments running simultaneously. And you can turn them on and off from this page. So you don't even have to go change the config. You can put in a URL override. It also gives you interesting page stats. Things like number of people visiting this page, percentage of page views, landings, et cetera, et cetera. And these are used, you can use these numbers to gauge whether or not the change that you want to make will actually have an impact on a significant number of users and whether you're going to have real impact on the bottom line. Earlier I said that we aim to make experiments easy to understand. And many experiments are really straightforward, and the tools that I just mentioned work really well for this class of experiments. But sometimes these tools aren't actually enough. So really we're just trying to make experiments easier to understand. People love to talk about experiments by saying, and then you just run an A/B experiment, as if the next day you magically have results that are easy to understand. But that's not true, and that's okay, because remember, we're doing these experiments not because they're easy, we're doing them to help our sellers, like Dana, be as successful as possible, and as many of them be as successful as possible, and to keep ourselves honest. So I'm going to talk about some puzzling outcomes real quickly, and these are real examples from Etsy and from Bing. The first one is we ran an experiment for a UI change to the shop storefronts and noticed that the bounce rate went up. The bounce rate, for those not familiar, is when someone visits your site and leaves without performing any actions. So this is generally considered something that's negative, but I'll let you decide whether that's good or bad yourself. So here's the control. This is what the UI treatment was before, and then this is what the UI treatment was afterwards. And so I don't know, I'll go back and forth one more time, but if anyone can see why the experiment might have done, why the bounce rate might have gone up from this version to this version. Probably not, because neither could we. So we went and we segmented the data in a bunch of different ways to find a group of users for which the bounce rate had increased. It turned out that shops with no listings saw an increase in bounces, so we looked at the visits in the two variants which landed on a shop with 0 listings. And what we noticed that what was happening was users were refreshing the page with the control. And the likely reason, or the hypothesis that we had, was because in this case, people didn't feel like the page had finished loading. But this actually wasn't a better experience. Even though they weren't technically bouncing, they were still exemplifying the same behavior as if it was a bounce. And so we came up with a new metric called refresh bounce, which looked at users who just refreshed and then left without doing anything else. And then we compared that metric in the control versus the experiment, and it turned out our experiment was actually doing better. And so this would have been an experiment where if we had just looked at the numbers that we originally had, we would have not launched this experiment or wouldn't have gone forward and said it was bad, when in fact it was actually a good result. Here's an interesting one from Bing. There's actually a paper which has 5 interesting experiment results from from Microsoft. There's a source at the bottom for those that are interested in reading it. But in this case, 2 of the top metrics at Bing is query share and revenue per search. And so a lot of projects were incentivized to increase these numbers, but this is actually a great example where short-term and long-term objectives diverge. And at first sight, you probably look at these numbers and you go, this is really good. Well, actually not so fast. It turns out there was actually a bug in the experiment which resulted in really poor listings, and they saw these results come out of that experiment. So let's break down the first metric that we have here, query share. So query share is actually just queries using Bing divided by the number of queries across the industry. And Bing can only really affect the numerator in this equation. And so let's break that down further. So in this case, users per month, query share is just users per month times sessions per user times distinct queries per session. And when you're running an A/B test, the users per month is actually stable, so it can't actually be affected. So we have to look at the other 2 variables that can be changed. And what we really want to measure is queries per successful task, but that's pretty hard to measure, and a session is a pretty good proxy for a single task. So we're going to rewrite the equation so that it looks like that. And this is a pretty common trick for experiments that take a really long time to run. You can find a proxy, something that's a leading indicator for whether or not this metric that takes a long time to move might move down the line. So if we have the number of queries per task going down, this means that users are actually accomplishing what they wanted faster, and assuming that they completed the task successfully. And this would actually be negative in the original metric that they'd share, query share. So what happened was users were having a harder time finding what they wanted, so they were doing actually more queries per task. So what Bing really should have been measuring in this case is the growth in the number of tasks per user, because that implies satisfaction and return visits. So the lesson learned here is picking the right metric is actually quite difficult. And there's a lot of people who talk about this, and I don't really have time to go in depth about it, but it's something one has to be really careful and go over and reassess on numerous occasions. So even though it's difficult, whatever you're working on, I'd highly recommend that you try to set up a culture where you make it easier to experiment with minimal versions and validate your assumptions with real numbers. Because more often than not, you're going to be surprised by the results. And we all want to do work that matters. And measuring your impact will ensure that you do the right thing for people like Dana more often than not. It might mean you spend less time coding and more time doing analysis, but it also means that you're going to spend more time working on things that won't get thrown out. Thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions for those that have questions. And while people are lining up for questions, I just thought I'd mention that if you're interested in learning more about our engineering war stories, I'd strongly encourage you to check out the Code as Craft blog, where we have videos of speakers coming in and talking about these things, and we have talks that we give and blog posts. And if you're interested in joining us in this work, this type of work, there's a link to apply, or come talk to me afterwards.
Okay, why do you think infinite scrolling was not a good idea for Etsy?
Could you say the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, why do you think infinite scrolling was not a good feature to have for Etsy in the end?
I mean, it could be a good feature down the line. I mean, it could have been because it was a desktop site. People aren't expecting it or used to it. I mean, we measured the two things that we thought were going to be the reason why people would like it, which is more listings and faster listings, and both of those things proved not to be true. And so it could be a handful of reasons. It could be people just get lost in the sea of listings. It could be a number. It could really be anything.
As a follow-up, as a follow-up to the infinite scrolling question, why not just having an option to have the user to have infinite scroll or not?
I mean, that's a good question. There's usually the more things that you put on your site means more things that you have to maintain, which it means it's more likely that you're going to break it. An example of a parallel to that is we used to have different ways that you could show results in the search page. You could either have tile view or a list view. And list view is very popular with sellers, or a small percentage of sellers. But people would get into list view and they would not know how to get out of it. And so it often ended up with more confusion. And so in the end, we got rid of the list view on the search results page, even though there was many people who liked, or a small percentage of people that liked it. It adds complication for people and they get lost.
Okay, thank you.
It's interesting that at Etsy you deal with both the merchants and the customers. So do you find there's a big difference in like how features affect users and in return affect the shops, or are features for both important at the same level?
Could you say the question again?
So since you're also dealing with the customers and the shops, do you find like features for one or the other are more important?
I mean, everything's kind of tied. At the end of the day, we're looking to help sellers sell as many things as possible or be as successful as possible. And so a buyer's success, or a person who enjoys the site more, is more likely to purchase something, is going to make the seller more successful. And sometimes the sellers don't like certain features, but it overall helps the marketplace, and it helps as many sellers be as successful as possible. And so we may choose to opt to do that, for example.
Could you give us a few more examples of where your intuition and features that you implemented just did not match up with what users wanted or were expecting?
Sure. Another example of an idea that at first blush might seem okay is selling or spending time to work on a feature to sell furniture. And we have different browse landing pages, and one of them is for furniture, and it's actually quite popular, but the number of sales that it gets is quite small. But even though the sales are small, the value of the item that's being sold is actually quite high. And so the intuition was like, oh, well, we can make this better by showing people local results. But even in the most optimistic scenario there, it wouldn't turn out to be good. like the return on investment is actually not nearly close enough to justify spending time on it. And so I'm not saying that everything should be looked at that way. Sometimes you have to make strategic choices in the hopes that the long-term payoff is going to be worth it. But if all your projects are like that, then maybe something's not quite right.
Thank you.
So that's all the time we have for questions, but just another big round of applause.